even having Chinese prisoners work for you. You have to feed the prisoners, but apparently these volunteers create this software for free. Or I think about the traditional pharmaceutical companies whose R&D was based on chemistry rather than biotech, and how those organizations are now struggling as their R&D productivity declines year after year after year. The point is that business models and strategies are not immortal. And strategy life cycles are getting shorter and shorter, yet most organizations have very little experience in reinventing the deep essence of who they are, in rebuilding their strategies from the ground up. Indeed, you might ask, what does it typically take in an organization for this work of renewal to get started? And you know the answer as well as I. It typically takes a crisis. Think back to IBM. It took a $14 billion shift in their earnings back in the mid-1990s to finally convince that company that they needed to change their business focus from being primarily product-centric to service-centric. The question is, how big of a threat, how big of a downturn will it take your organization before it begins to think creatively and deeply about its strategy, its purpose, and its mission? And then you might ask, what do companies do once they get into that kind of trouble? What happens when you begin to go through that valley of the shadow of death kind of experience? And the first thing that typically happens is we replace the leadership. Now, think about that just for a moment. It really suggests that leaders are the reason companies fundamentally succeed or fail. I'd like to take issue with that for just a moment. I think oftentimes we treat these large, complicated organizations in a way the same way we would treat Venezuela or Zimbabwe or some poorly governed third world country, where the only way you can change policy and direction is a coup. You change the people at the top. And yet, if you think about it, the reason large organizations so often miss the future is not because they had a few people at the top that really weren't paying attention. They miss the future because organizations, by and large, have been built for perpetuation rather than innovation. And so the challenges we face are not moving a few people to the top. Indeed, it's very interesting. As companies have been experiencing more and more performance shortfalls, executive tenures have been getting shorter and shorter. That's hardly a cure for this systemic problem of deep organizational renewal. So we have to do better than this, right? We cannot be satisfied with organizations that periodically go through these deep crises. You know, I recently went back and I read the last decade or so of books written about organizational change. You've seen many of these titles. And I kind of unpacked all that writing and all that theory. It struck me that the stories really fell into two categories. There are either stories about change at the periphery, companies that move from direct distribution channels to indirect channels, companies that move from client-server to e-business, but really not change at the core of the business. And when you did read about changes at the core, those were stories about turnarounds, stories about companies that had gone into crisis and then dug themselves out of the pit, with all the heroes there, the turnaround artists that had helped them do that. Folks like Lou Gerstner at IBM, Carlos Ghosn at Nissan, Rosemary Bravo at Burberry's. Now, those are great stories. But my wish for your company is that you never go through one of those turnarounds, that you never go through that valley of the shadow of death experience. And to do that, we're going to have to do something more than simply having periodic, once-in-a-while renewal. So remember, we started by talking about revolution, innovation with respect to industry rules. Then we've talked for a few minutes about renewal, innovation with respect to my own historic business model. But so often that renewal is episodic, crisis-driven, and programmatic. It happens once every decade or two in the midst of a crisis, and the way we do the work of renewal is we create some new big program, we get everybody on board, we try to mobilize the whole organization. Let me suggest that we need instead to be able to do the work of renewal in a way that is continuous, that is opportunity-driven, and that is intrinsic rather than programmatic. And that leads me to the third kind of innovation, resilience. Innovation that is not periodic reconstruction, innovation that is continuous reconstruction, reinvention of who we are and what we do. And I would argue there are very few organizations that have yet mastered the art of resilience. You know, let me use an analogy for a moment. I want you to think about perhaps You're coming out of a supermarket, crossing the parking lot there. You have a young toddler, child in hand, and they suddenly break free and they start running out through the parking lot. What's going to happen? Without thinking about it for a moment, you will chase after the child. Your heart rate will accelerate just automatically. That will happen in an instant. Or think about when you have to perform in front of a group. Maybe it is back when you were a high school student and you were performing in some recital. Maybe you're standing up in front of your colleagues to give a speech. But spontaneously, your adrenal glands will start pumping adrenaline. There's no order from brain central to your glands for this to happen. It just happens. Or think of what happens when an attractive person walks in front of you. Somebody you find attractive suddenly comes into your line of sight. Your pupils will dilate reflexively. This is true for men and women. Nothing you can do about it. Now think about the words I just used. Automatic, spontaneous, reflexive. Are these the words we use to describe change in large organizations? Of course they're not. Instead, change is something that occurs in kind of episodic way. It occurs with enormous kind of friction, and it's not anything that feels natural and just part of what organizations are. We're going to have to change this. I'd like you to think of a ratio for a moment. And this is how I think about resilience. It's a simple ratio. And the numerator of this ratio is the frequency and magnitude of strategic change, strategic transformation. Now, the environment is going to force the numerator to go up. We are going to have to be able to change more often and more significantly than we ever have before. That's simply a fact. The denominator of this ratio, though, is the time, expense, and trauma that it takes to effect that change. So it seems to me the trick in a world of accelerating change is how to get the numerator to go up without the denominator going up even faster. How to be capable of this deep, continuous change without paying a huge organizational price for it. I would like to set a goal, therefore. I'd like you to begin to think about zero trauma change. Change where there are no cataclysmic reorganizations, no convulsive restructurings, no across-the-board layoffs, no huge unexpected write-offs, where there's plenty of change but no trauma. Now that may sound almost naive to you. It may sound impossible. But I think it's absolutely possible. Let me give you an analogy for a moment. I'm just old enough to remember when automobiles really were not built very well at all. I don't know what you were driving back in 1975, but maybe it was a Ford Pinto or a Chevy Vega or some other poorly built automobile. But it was about that time that a few people started to talk about zero defects. And if you were driving one of those sorry automobiles, the very notion of zero defects would have seemed absurd to you, simply impossible to accomplish. And yet here we are, 30, 35 years later, and we talk about Six Sigma, that's 3 defects per million, as if it's a natural kind of thing we should just expect to be able to do this. Well, clearly, poor quality costs money. And there's a good reason to commit ourselves to zero defects. But I would argue a lack of resilience costs even more. We pay a heavy price for it in terms of dispirited employees, in terms of missed opportunities. And so if quality was worth solving as a problem, I will tell you resilience is very much worth solving. Because if you think about it, the work of renewal typically happens in one of two ways. It is either tardy, right? Companies wake up too late and pay a huge price for not having seen the world changing around them. Or occasionally it is foolhardy, where an executive, maybe Jean-Marie Messier there at Vivendi, or Bernard Levin, Jerry Levin at AOL Time Warner, or somebody else believes that they can do the work of renewal in one giant leap, typically done with some big kind of mega deal. Well, I can tell you, whether you're tardy or foolhardy, you typically end up with the same kind of problem, and that is a huge write-off. Whether it's a write-off for a poorly conceived deal or a write-off for simply being late and all the restructuring charges that result from that, that's what happens. And indeed, if you look at over the last several decades, the amount of exceptional charges against earnings that are taken by the S&P 500 companies, net of gains, exceptional charges against earnings, net of gains, that number has